Hello, welcome to Artist Confessional. I'm Chrissy, and today Kyle and I are going to share with you how we made 4 giant pop-up books. We worked with Mount Sinai and Bespoke Collective to create 4 huge pop-ups to celebrate Mount Sinai's 100th anniversary. These pop-ups were like the biggest pop-ups we've ever made. 2 of them were 4 feet by 8 feet when you open them up, and the other 2 were 2 feet by 4 feet. Not only were these pop-ups bigger than we'd ever worked with, they were also constructed in a way that we hadn't really done in the past either. Normally, I have been making pop-ups with Jenna Kush that come out like this, like windows or doors or pulled off a wall. These pop-ups were coming open flat on a surface, so all the work had to come up vertically into the air. So it was quite a challenge, lots of drawing, lots of planning, lots of mistakes, and in the end we created 4 pieces that we're so proud of.
What are the secrets of studio practice? I wanna know all your good and bad habits. How do you make art like a pro? There's so many ways to do so. Stick around, cause you'll find out on Artist Confessionals.
Artist Confessionals.
Artist Confessionals with Sparkbox Studio.
This project came together because of a few different factors. Part of it was that early in 2020, I believe, Kyle and I had worked with Bespoke Collective as a consultancy for us to talk about the residency. Earlier this year, I had posted a video of a pop-up I had made with Jenna Kush that was like a door and a couple of windows that we had made for a show at Blizzmax. Because Bespoke had worked with us in the past, they started following us on social media, which meant that when I posted the video of the pop-up, they saw it and recognized that it would be a great opportunity to bring us on board to work with Mount Sinai, a client that they were working with to celebrate their 100th anniversary. I asked Kyle if he would work with me, and I developed pop-ups and Kyle developed drawings. The goal of the project was to bring to life the history of the buildings that Mount Sinai has occupied since its foundation 100 years ago. The organization had started in 100 Yorkville in Toronto, and then it moved to create 550 University Avenue. Then it developed a new site at 600 University Avenue, and then it has expanded to create like more of a number of different sites, which include Bridgepoint. So the 4 pop-ups illustrate those different buildings and a little bit of a storyline for each one of them.
The original scope of this project was to create white-on-white pop-ups that would pop out of this book. They'd be a white building with white facades and a white plain surface. That's where it started. Where it ended up was vastly different. Somewhere near the beginning of this project, once Chrissy and I got started really into drawing it, through our meetings with the team, we decided that it needed a bit more oomph. Seeing just a white building on a big white void just wasn't special enough. So we talked about what we could do. And then we started talking about illustrations. Well, what if the building could be drawn? Okay, cool, we'll start drawing buildings. You know, some basic elevation drawings like blueprints. Cool, that's where we started kind of this additional work. It quickly spiraled into more additional work and then more additional work. So not only were we now drawing just elevations of the building, but we were drawing aerial views of the entire street area around it. And then it expanded even further with, well, what could we put color into it? And just putting color into a large drawing is not the simplest, but I do think that in the end, this was the right choice for the project. Although it started off as just white on white, and then it turned into black line artwork on white, and then it ended up being blue line work on white, because the blue was the blue in the branding of the color, the branding of the show, and I think that that was a really solid choice. I'm really excited about how they all turned out. I think that it added a lot to the project. I didn't have architectural drawings and elevations to reference or to draw from, so all of the illustrations that I did were through Google Street View or Google Earth, where I spent time in Google Earth or in the Street View to combine them together to create an understanding of a three-dimensional object. The very first challenge that I had to kind of tackle with was the scale of the building in relationship to the plane of the pop-up building, in relationship to when the pop-up mechanism was closed, to ensure that none of the stuff stuck out the edges of the book. It's not as simple as it sounds. It was a lot of back and forth between Chrissy and I. She'd create a mock-up of like, hey, I think this mechanism will work. And then I would take those measurements, bring them into Photoshop and be like, okay, well, I can set the scale to here. Okay, send it back to her. She would rebuild the thing and then see if it would actually function. The project ended up being vinyl stickers. It went through quite a few iterations prior to getting to this point. We had thought about screen printing it. We had thought about hand illustrating it and watercoloring it. We had thought about using the Cricut to use the pen tool and draw it on the Cricut machine. We had thought about like printing it ourselves off of a digital printer, and ultimately the vinyl was the best choice. It would have the strongest kind of stability. It was going to last a lot longer. The light fastness of the colors was going to be of a professional quality. There was a lot of good reasons for it, and ultimately the biggest one was that we did not have time to print all of this. When you like math it out, it ended up being a 4 foot by 8 foot, a 4 foot by 8 foot, a 2 foot by 4 foot, a 2 foot by 4 foot, a 2 foot by 4-ish foot, like the building shape itself, times 4, plus all of these pop-up elements. Like it became like literally hundreds of square feet of drawing. And it was just going to be at a size that wasn't going to be possible. And even the printer that we worked with a local printing company called Printcraft, and they could do 24-inch vinyl. 24-inch vinyl is not wider than 4 feet, so what ended up happening was all of the big aerial views, we had to splice the drawing into 2 halves so that we could stick on the bottom half and then stick on the top half. And we had to like design in mind that this was going to be the end game. The printer can't print all the way up to the edges of 24 inches, so we had to make this design choice to have a white border around the aerial view and shrink the overall size of the gator board by a couple centimeters, so that when we would lay it up on 24 inches and we'd lay up the other half on 24 inches, there was like a gap and an overlap of about yay big. And that was like our margin of error, so that when we laid it down, they would sit on top of one another and align. Choosing to work with vinyl as opposed to any of the other methods like really took out a lot of barriers for us. Chrissy has had a lot of experience working with her dad as a vinyl assistant and laying down vinyl, and thankfully she had had that experience, because like so much of this like rode on like, can you put down a giant 2 foot by 8 foot sticker without getting air bubbles in it? That's like what most of the construction process was just, can you put down the sticker flat? And luckily Chrissy is like really, really good at doing that. And Printcraft really came through for us. And I just wanted to like pause for a moment and say thank you to Printcraft.
For every single one of the pop-up buildings, Kyle and I just looked at a lot of Google Street View images of the buildings and what they looked like, and we tried to think about different ways to approach the mechanisms for the pop-ups so that each of the books had a unique feel to them. It didn't just look like the same mechanism repeated over and over and over again with a different visual stuck on top of it. When I was planning the buildings, originally I had thought I might make the pop-ups be more of a zigzag fold or a parallel fold, folds and mechanisms that I'm more comfortable working with. Once I started expanding the size, I realized that that just functionally wasn't going to work. The paper that I had wasn't strong enough to hold the forms very well. They would either want to flop forward or flop down. And we didn't have time to find a company that could CNC cut gator boards so that we could have rigid, hard materials that would hold themselves really nicely over time. That meant that I had to work with mechanisms that were relatively new to me. So I started with 550 University because A, I had a really clear vision of how the dumbwaiter was going to work and I was excited about that. And two, the building is more or less a rectangle. So I thought, okay, well, this will be an easy place to start. Little did I know that the rectangle is only a rectangle to the roof, and then it turns into a multitude of other shapes and rectangles. So it turned into a little bit more of a complicated build than I was anticipating, but I think we came to a nice result. The main part of the building is essentially a box mechanism. So there's a post in the center that's two laminated pieces of paper that sort of go across the gutter, which is the fold of the paper. And they come up and they make the roof and the sides. So when you close the paper, that middle section goes up in the air and the two sides come together to rest against it. Then the exterior walls of the building are separate sheets of paper that have tabs on them that are glued to the sides of the building, and it's folded in the center so they sort of come out on either side and collapse down. The top of the building, while very similar in construction, so it still has that middle, center, etc., because it has like a cutout and a little bump back and then these little windows that come down, it was surprisingly difficult to get all of those tiers to fold together flat and to work together properly. I thought that it would just be like building a cake, it's just like repeat on the top, but I was a little bit wrong about that. I also learned in this mechanism that it has to be equal. So both sides of the page have to be the same measurements. I tried multiple times to see if I could get the very top tier, because it was so little, to be slightly off center, because on the building it actually is a little bit longer on one side than the other. But it never worked. It always crumpled and folded terribly. So we learned pretty quickly from this mechanism that if we were going to use the box fold, each side had to be equal.
So 550 University, when you look at Google Street View, there are many buildings around it. It has had at least one major renovation. What was cool was that the team put together a series of like historical photos of the building. So I had to take all of this reference material that they had pulled out, these old photographs, and kind of like compare them to the Google Street Views that I had been taking and kind of determine what was actually there and what wasn't there, and have to kind of marry those two things together to ensure that it was in scale and in proportion, but also historically accurate for kind of the time period that we were like trying to work from.
For this particular building, the focus for the story was the advanced tech that this property had. And Mount Sinai had invested in some very like progressive technology for the time. And one of the stories that they were really excited about was this dumbwaiter that they had within the property. So we decided to focus our pop-up on that part of the story. The mechanism that I decided to use for the dumbwaiter is a pull mechanism. So it's just a pull tab. So it's a long tab of paper that goes behind another sheet of paper, and another piece of paper is placed on top, and as you're pulling the tab, it's moving an image underneath through windows so you can see it moving down. And it can be used like in a multitude of different directions and for a lot of different things. You can have something sort of like reveal itself and then hide itself away, or like the dumbwaiter, it looks as if it is moving through space from one scene to the next. I talked to Kyle and he got really excited about creating these vignettes in each of the spaces. So I had proposed a sort of cross cut of a building. So looking into a building as if it had been sliced down the middle. Part of it was moved aside so you could see floor from floor from floor. And Kyle proposed making each of those floors highlight more of the technology that Mount Sinai was very proud to have had in their facility during that time.
We had always intended to illustrate these mechanisms and to create little scenes. With the addition of color, it actually made these scenes a lot easier to illustrate. because it wasn't just reliant on strong black and white line artwork. We could bring in color, and that really gives contrast, which makes an illustration a lot more legible. I used the reference images that the client provided to us. They dated back to about the 1920s. A lot of them were from the mid-century, and these helped give me an idea of what the physical machinery and things looked like at the time, which made illustrating them a lot easier because I didn't have to spend days hunting the internet for time-appropriate photographs and reference material.
100 Yorkville was the first building that Mount Sinai had occupied, and it was basically crowdfunded by a collection of women who went out and worked with their community to build the resources to buy this property and open this hospital. The building was so beautiful. It's still beautiful. The building still exists in Toronto. It's just now giant and has a bunch of apartments on it. And it is just a really gorgeous brick building. So we wanted to have it come out of the pop-up in a bit of a different way than the mechanism that we used for 550. Inspired by one of the pages in an Alice in Wonderland pop-up book, I decided to have 100 Yorkville come out on an angle and basically be this very crisp, dense brick of a building, because it is this kind of gorgeous brick building. So that was an interesting challenge because I didn't have any sort of breakdown of how this particular mechanism worked. For the box mechanism, I used a few different books that show you exactly how to create that type of structure. And for this one, I had to take a pop-up book that I have and essentially take it apart and try to really study how the mechanism was built. So it was a different type of learning. To start with this type of process, I make littler mock-ups. So just using, 8.5 by 11, or sometimes I was using Cricut paper, which is 12 by 12, to create a small study before I move into the larger scale. And I try to make them either half scale or quarter scale, but as Kyle can attest, sometimes I'm not so great at being perfect with my math, which isn't ideal for pop-ups, but I do my best and they generally work. The reason for the angle in 100 Yorkville was mostly just to make it a little bit more dynamic when you opened up the pop-up. On top of that, I had originally thought that it would allow for me to have this architectural feature that the building technically has, which is it's kind of a rectangle in the center, and then it has two little boxes on the side. And when I was first looking at different ways to build this mechanism, that seemed possible. But once I actually started building it to scale with the aerial map laid out on the mock-up, I realized that that didn't actually work because it was folding into the gutter incorrectly. So I had to make adjustments. So it turned into a really rigid rectangle, and then we put onto the front of that rectangle a little foam core bump out of the where the door and this little balcony is, and that also helped keep that front piece of paper very, very rigid, because for the most part this particular pop-up is just straight paper, 15 point paper, and the only rigid part of it, the mat board, is the middle brace. So there's a little middle brace that comes up and pushes everything up, and then the front foam core element that helps keep that long rectangle from going all wiggly woggly when you close the book.
100 Yorkville was probably the biggest challenge I experienced, and also the biggest success of this entire project for myself. Illustrating this had some big hurdles for me to overcome. The first one being that it was a building they occupied in the 1920s. So the variety of reference images that I got from the client was maybe 3 images in total. And they were okay, but they didn't really give me a holistic picture of what the building looked like. I tried to rely heavily on Google Street View to help me understand what the building shape was, what kind of environment was around it, but I came into this really big hurdle where the building has gone through like a major renovation. It's now a Chanel store, and they had picked up the building and moved it back from the street curb. So where it is now wasn't where it was in the 1920s. And I felt like it was important that depicting this building and this building's aerial view to be the most accurate as possible was really important. So I did something really cool, which was I ended up going to the City of Toronto's archives, and they have been taking aerial photographs of the city since the 1940s to try to discern how that building sat in relationship to the street and what other objects were around it and what kind of shapes those were, so that the aerial view would be the most accurate possible. I felt like it was really important to try to achieve some sort of accuracy there.
The story for this building was that even though it was this small sort of residential space that didn't have an awful lot of rooms to support the community, they made every room count, including the cloakroom. So the cloakroom of 100 Yorkville would often be transformed into this multi-functional space, including a place where patients would be helped. So we wanted to have a mechanism that made it feel like you were pulling back the coats of this cloakroom to peer into a scene where a patient was being assisted by a doctor and a nurse. The team really wanted to highlight this story because it's kind of the story of what Mount Sinai represents, which is a very community-focused hospital. They always wanted to support people and make space for folks throughout the entirety of their history. So having this be the highlight of this first building, because it's the first pop-up that you see when you walk into the exhibition. So having that be the story that's brought to life right away, I think really extends to every single space that they've occupied since. This was probably one of the hardest mechanisms. I naively thought it was going to be simple. I don't know why, but my sister had, well, she still has it. My sister has this like Harry Potter, like Hogwarts book, and the mechanisms are wild. It's by Matthew Reinhardt. He's the like paper engineer, does amazing work. And in one of them, there's like the map. I don't know what the map's called, but like in one of the Harry Potter, I haven't read the books, but so one of the Harry Potter movies, they like watch the footprints on the map appear. So that mechanism, you sort of like hold the edges of the map, and as you open it up, the feet on the inside move. I thought, oh, that would be a perfect mechanism, and it seemed relatively simple. I was wrong about that. And so I did a similar thing that I did with the Alice in Wonderland book. I just took measurements and very carefully built a to scale to the map in the Harry Potter book version of that mechanism, and then kind of played around with it to make it suit the needs of our particular mechanism. So I removed some parts, I made the edges a bit different, I obviously changed the scale and that sort of thing so that we could recreate a similar action, but with the components that we wanted, which was cloaks and a flat scene of this doctor, nurse, and patient. The third building that I worked on was Bridgepoint, and this building was probably the most intimidating for both Kyle and I because it is like a beautiful building, it's won tons of awards, and it is very complicated. It has a lot of like poppy outy, like different, it's a wild building, I don't know how to describe it. And trying to articulate in a pop-up the different levels, the different materials, the, you know, these little terraces and all sorts of things was, I'm just not that level of paper engineer that I could accomplish those goals. My initial plan for this building was to at least showcase the fact that there were 2 levels and this central column of windows. So I was working with the box pop-up for the middle, and that was going to act as this column of glass. And it was working as a small mock-up, basically. And it was even working at its full scale, at the 2x4. The only problem was that I was using tape for the majority of these small scale mock-ups, and in this case, because I was constantly like altering it and making little adjustments, because this particular mechanism was very, very fussy. You had to have like all these different cuts, and it was just complicated. And at a certain point I was getting sick of like gluing or taping things down, so I started just using a staple. And what I didn't consider was that the staple has like a bit of flexibility in its turning. So it was allowing some rotation in the paper that was making the mechanism flow very, very nicely. But once that was replaced with aggressive industrial glue, there was no flexibility or rotation in the paper. It was stuck permanently in place on the board. And therefore, the final mechanism we ended up going with was not this particular setup, which was disappointing, but sometimes you just have to let things go. So the final mechanism that we did, which was actually Kyle's creation, because I had built this thing so many times and was seeing so many bad results that I kind of threw my hands in the air, and I really didn't know what to do. And so Kyle basically created a W fold. So going back again to that box fold, but instead of having it fold basically like this, it was folding like this. It was like a little W that folded down in nice and flat so that nothing poked out of the sides. It still looked really beautiful once it opened. It still felt a little bit different than the standard box fold, but it resolved the issues that I was seeing, and it still highlighted the building really nicely.
Drawing orthographic projections and elevations of buildings and of objects in general, this is not uncommon to me. I do it for the studio layouts, I do it for construction projects, I do it in my own artwork. The challenge and kind of the adaptation that I had to make was how to change those and make those not just true to reality, but convert them to fit a pop-up form. Illustrating Bridgepoint was a challenge in a different way. When you try to draw it as a more simplified shape, like kind of a rectangle, it becomes very confusing, and I had a lot of troubles with this one because it has so many weird facets that there will be parts that are cantilevered out and other parts that are not cantilevered. There's a change in materials, and I had a lot of struggle trying to ensure that the proportions of this building and the illustration of this building could be simplified down from a very complex series of rectangles into like a singular rectangle.
Bridgepoint has just the most gorgeous windows. Like, the whole building is basically beautiful windows, which means that each of the rooms in this particular hospital have just the nicest sight lines of the city skyline. And that was the focus of this particular additional storyline, was that they weren't only just providing like excellent care in these spaces, but they were also trying to create environments that if people were having to stay in these spaces for prolonged periods of time, they would at least have a space that felt beautiful. So for this one, I was excited to work with a mechanism that I have wanted to play around with for a long time, but haven't really found the right place for. This mechanism is called the dissolve mechanism, according to Duncan Birmingham, who is a pop-up bookmaker that I've watched a lot of videos on how to build pop-ups. So with this one, you have 2 images and you're cutting all your papers on these very specific angles so that they meld into one another. So we wanted to have the skyline of Toronto go from day to night and have the patient being able to sit and stare out this window at this beautiful scene. And then the interactive part was allowing the participants to change the skyline from day to night.
This one was a bit of a challenge because of the reference images that I had of Bridgepoint's interior spaces were slightly limited. Even through like extensive Google searching, there's only so many photographs of the interior of the bedrooms that like were just available to me. So I wanted to accurately illustrate the like machinery in there, the bed, the chairs, the space itself, and all of this had to be condensed into a portrait-sized illustration. Now, most photographs are landscape, and so trying to like sandwich this into a space that's like this is just like it's just a drawing challenge, period. I had to illustrate the daytime nighttime scene of like Toronto during the day, Toronto during the night with a very limited color palette. And I think we did okay with it. Like it was a challenge unto itself. But at this point in the project, like it was so close to the end of it that it was like just, you just start and you just go. There wasn't time to like really think or ponder or like do sketches. It was just, you had to get into it and draw it, and it turned out really cool. And I think it was really successful. And there was like just some things that were very serendipitous about it, such as I had this idea to just make very light yellow dotted vertical lines on all of the buildings to illustrate their like nighttime window light. And then at the very end, I looked at it and I was like, oh, it doesn't feel quite nighttimey enough. Like we changed the sky from like white to blue. And then I realized I just had to stick like a dotted halftone pattern across the bottom half of the nighttime scene and like let it fade up. And then all of a sudden, like it all came together.
The last building that I worked on was 600 University, which is the present Mount Sinai Hospital. This building is humongous, not only in real life, but in our pop-up. It was massive. The feature that we wanted to highlight for this particular building is that from the air, it's actually creating an H in its structure. So we wanted to make sure that our pop-up reflected that. So for this particular building, I had originally started with a post in the center and a flap on the top that connected to two box folds that just had like straight edges. So thin box fold across the center and a post. And that was okay, but what we ended up doing was basically creating a full box. So two large edges and two large fronts. And then we used counterfolds, which is when you basically cut two lines and you fold in the center and you push parts of those back. So that allowed for the top of the box to create an H and the sides of the box to have elements fold in so that from above you see that H, and from the side you get to see additional parts of the building that are existing on that interior post. The challenge of this building was working with the size. So this was another one of the 8-foot by 4-foot scale pieces, and we wanted the building to occupy an enormous part of this layout, basically, because the building was just a very large building. That was like a huge feature for Mount Sinai, was that they had created this very huge hospital to support their community. When creating the mock-ups for this model, I had shown Kyle what was working within the scale that we had, because a big part of these box folds is that those front parts fold out. So the width of the building determines the distance from the side of the building to the edge of the book. So if the width of the building is larger than that front face to the edge of the book, then your building is going to spill out of the sides of the book, which is not ideal. So when I made a mock-up that felt successful, I brought it up to Kyle, and in the drawing, he made sure that he scaled his drawing so that it didn't exceed those parameters. So we could still have this massive height and create a really large structure, but when it closed flat, we weren't having any part of the pop-up expose itself on the edge of the book. So we used archival mat board to give some structure and some rigidity to parts of the pop-up, and in this one we put it on both of the sides because it had that counterfold in, which just took away some of the integrity of the paper, and so it needed a little bit of like extra support. With each of the pop-ups leading up to this one, they're relatively breezy to open. It feels like not intimidating. But this one, when you open it, it feels a little intimidating. You have to just commit to opening it because of the weight of the mat board on either side and the sheer scale of the piece. Opening and closing it feels just really different. It's almost like the largeness of this building is being felt. It's not just being seen when you're opening it up, but you can feel it as you open and close the book. The feature for this building was talking about the size and the capacity of this building and highlighting their ongoing investment in maternity and labor and delivery. In our mechanism for this, we worked with one of my favorites. This mechanism I've used in a past project with Jenna Cush, and it's one that I just adore. It's basically a very intimate but kind of disorientating mechanism. How it works is you have a number of different squares. In our case, we had 7. And on each of the levels, there are like growing and shrinking holes cut through the middle. And surrounding those holes are illustrations. And the participant will lift up and they'll look inside of the mechanism. And when they look down through all of those holes, they're seeing all of these layers of information kind of colliding together to create a unified story. We thought this was a perfect way to highlight the intensity of a hospital, the different layers of activity that are happening in a space like that. And for this, we focused on the maternity ward. I just love this one. I think it turned out so well. This was a really interesting drawing experience because it's not a very common angle to draw things from above. I helped Kyle a little bit with the drawings of these ones because we were getting into crunch time and we needed a little bit of everybody participates and gets into the mud on this. And it, for me, was pretty wild because I've never drawn anything from that angle before, so it was totally new. And in the end, I just think it resulted in it was just a perfect mechanism for this story.
Likely one of the weirdest series of drawings I've done in a long time was our vertical pop-up look at me perspective illustration mechanism. I don't really know what the name of this is. I just know that it was really cool to draw this thing. It was so weird and challenging because the reference material that we were working from was like physically about yay big. And it was from an Alice in Wonderland book where you could see Alice falling through like a hole. It worked incredibly well for that. But we wanted to illustrate like multiple floors of a hospital and for it to be legible. So like not only are we at this point now trying to draw people from like an aerial perspective, but also machinery and objects, and like it was such a weird thing to draw, but like I think it turned out really, really well. Surprisingly, I think that we did a good job at drawing people from above. It's really not something that you normally do. And it took like a lot of weird reference photos to like make sure that the people like actually were legible. And it took a couple iterations of like laying it up in Photoshop to make sure that the objects would line up where we wanted it to, because like the viewing size when we deconstructed it, it starts off as like just a square with a small peephole, and on each one of the layers, although it's a square, it's really, you only see about this much. And there's only about like a band about yay big all the way around the hole that's actually visible. So all the illustration had to sit within this band if we wanted to be able to see it. So we had a couple weird challenges to contend with. Working as we normally do, we constructed all of the pieces as assets so we could individually move them around, which allowed us to kind of build it all, trial it, and then go, oh, this was successful, this wasn't. Okay, let's move this person here or this person here. And that allowed us to kind of like combat this like problem of the how do you even like illustrate 7 floors of scenery on a whole bunch of like donut shaped bands? And like it took quite a number of trials. It turned out really, really well. Like I'm really surprised at how well this one worked.
After we completed all these beautiful pop-ups, we got to drive to Toronto to deliver them to their final exhibition space, which was at the Art Gallery of Ontario, otherwise known as the AGO, where they were put into the Mount Sinai 100 experience alongside all the other components of this overall celebration of Mount Sinai's 100 years. Driving up to the loading dock of the AGO was just really, really exciting. Having work go into this particular space as Canadian artists who grew up going there to see shows just was such an absolute privilege. And then to come up and see all the work that Bespoke Mount Sinai had put into creating just a beautiful display of the history of this organization, and to be a part of that. And quite a large part, we had an entire zone where the books were the feature, which we knew because we saw these drawings, but it was very different to actually go there and see how much space and how important the pop-up books were to this exhibition. It just was very different than seeing like an AutoCAD drawing on a computer screen during a Zoom call. We are just so happy with these pieces. They pushed us like really beyond what we were used to doing. It challenged us to take on new roles and to see our work displayed in a totally different way. We were so honored to be asked to be part of this, not only because it felt really special to be part of this like celebration of an organization that's done so much over 100 years, but also to have our work shown in a space that for 2 artists is just like immensely exciting. And then the end result, we were just like, I mean, part of us is a little bit sad that we don't have any of them here anymore. Like all the books are gone. We just made them and they're gone. So, you know, it makes us feel really interested in how we can explore this particular type of making in different ways and in different practices for more of our work. And yeah, I'm just really excited to have done it. So 10 out of 10, huge success, so happy. Yeah, can't wait to do something like this again. Thanks so much for joining us again on this episode of Artist Confessional. We hope that you enjoyed watching our video of making giant pop-ups. If you can like this video, subscribe, or join us on Patreon, any type of support is so greatly appreciated. And we'll be coming back again with another art journey soon.